All right, I do believe we are recording. And this is an example of the project that we're going to do today with ink blending. And I just wanted to show you what I started with, which is a piece of Very Vanilla. This is the thick Very Vanilla. It started as 8.5 by 5.5, and on the 8.5 side, just scored at 4.25. That's just a regular old A2 card. And then by adding ink blending, the card goes from this to this. And the tools that I used are really pretty basic. I'm going to use one of the stamps from the new Elegantly Said stamp set, the one, the flower one. So I am just going to pop that one out. It's a really pretty flower. Obviously, any image that you have will work really well. And I'm just going to pop that onto an acrylic block. Because all the stamping that I'm going to be doing, except for the sentiment, I will use a Stamparatus, but everything else is going to be done using the acrylic block. For me, this is a little bit different because I used my Stamparatus more than I do the blocks. I'm really trying to get back to using the blocks a little bit more. And then one of the really important tools that I'm going to use, Post-it notes. The reason I love Post-it notes for this kind of design is they have a great tack on them. It's not super sticky. It will adhere to the card base without causing an issue of pulling up any paper that would look like I've ripped the card. And because I'm using a straight line, and we'll talk about different designs in a second, this Post-it note is just absolutely perfect for what I want to do. And then I've got some blending brushes. I'm sorry I'm not using the Stampin' Up! Ones. I am going to get some of those. They're on back order right now. They're super popular. This is a brand that I just picked up online, but I will be using 4 different blending brushes. You don't need to go crazy with blending brushes. You don't need 4. And then I'm also going to be using 4 different colors that are included in the new in colors that will be coming up in the new annual catalog. So here's what I did. And this is just this is what I did. This isn't this is what you need to do. And I've talked about this before, and I'm getting a little particular about where I'm going to put my Post-it notes because I already have my other stamp set up in my Stamparatus, and I know where I want that to go. So I'm really trying to mimic the measurements that I have on here. That's what I'm doing. Please don't follow exactly where I'm putting the Post-it notes. Please put them where you want to, but I just also wanted to give you a little tip that the Stamparatus can be a second pair of hands for you. It's not just a great tool to be able to stamp and do precision stamping. It's also a great tool if you want to make sure that things don't move around when you are working on them. You obviously know you've got magnets, but it's also a wonderful way to use the grid paper, the grid paper. So I've put a piece down. I do have the foam underneath, and I've put my card base on the top, and I know where I want the marks to be. And again, I'm being a little persnickety in the way I want to do this. You don't need to do that. And what I'm going to do is I am going to place a Post-it note where I want to block off where the ink is going to go. So where I have put that down, and again, I'm using my own little design, is the tack is right at the top of where I'm trying to protect the ink from going on the paper. So I'll have ink going up here, but obviously the ink is not going to go behind that Post-it note. Now, I don't want that Post-it note to go all the way down to the bottom because I'm actually going to mask, if I bring this back in, The area that I'm initially masking is going to be where you see the green line, where the flowers are on the top, and where the green line is and the flowers on the bottom. We're going to come back and we're going to do another masking to do the purple. But the first ones that I want to do are where that green and my stamping stops. So that means I've got to block or mask the middle of the card. This Post-it note is going to be too wide. I don't need all of that. So I'm actually going to just cut off some of the bottom of that. And I'm not going to get super crazy whether it's straight or not, because I'm going to put another Post-it on the bottom. I just want to make sure that I have enough of the middle part covered so that I won't get any ink on it. So I put one Post-it note up at the top. I'm just going to flip this around. It's just because it's easier for me to do. I'm going to grab another Post-it note. And you may see, or you may find that you use a lot of Post-it notes on this. It does consume some, but you can reuse them, especially if you're doing the same design. You can reuse them a couple of times. When you start seeing that the ink is bleeding through, you definitely need to switch it. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that when I cut this one off, that I've got enough Post-it note of the original one underneath. So I'm still blocking where I want to go. Now, there are alternatives. You don't need to use a Post-it note. You could take copy paper. You could cut your copy paper into whatever shape or size you want. You can use the two-way glue, which essentially will create a Post-it note for you. And then you can just put that Post-it note where you want it to be blocked. Now, this is all set for me to do my little magic. So I'm going to take this piece off and I'm going to bring it over to where I'm going to do my ink blending. Couple of things. One is that if this bothers you where there's one flap that's coming up, and if you have the idea or thought that maybe you should put a piece of tape here, I advise you not to. The reason is, and I did this, so I know from experience, I put a piece of Scotch tape when I did one of these, and I'm going to be getting ink on these Post-it notes. If you put Scotch tape, that Scotch tape is not going to absorb the ink, and it is very, very, very likely that you are going to get ink on your fingers as you work with this ink blending, and you might accidentally get ink where you don't want it. So I would not recommend using any kind of tape or anything like that to get rid of that little piece that might be sticking out. Just kind of go with it. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to stamp my flowers. I want to get those down first. And what I'm going to do, if I bring back the example card, I'm going to stamp those as close to my Post-it note as I can, because I want it to look like those flowers are sort of tucked behind where I will eventually put the purple strip. So if you're not using a Post-it note, one really good thing to keep in mind too is you want your mask to be as thin a piece of paper as you can get. Don't use cardstock. Don't use a piece of acetate because it's really not thin enough. And if you don't have a thin piece of paper, you may not be able to stamp really close to the edge. There's going to be a little bit of a ledge that you're going to be working against when you actually stamp. And I'm going to be using the new Evening Evergreen. I had to cheat and look at the name upside down. And I'm just going to make sure that I've got a good stamped image. And I'm going to do this kind of slowly because I want to make sure that when I press this down, I am giving it a good push. And I'm doing that because I have that little lip that I am working against, and then I can bring it up. Now, a couple of things to think about. You always want to re-ink your image before you stamp again when you're doing something like this, because inevitably where you inked on your cardstock, where you inked where there's that little lip that you're trying to get over, you're not going to have taken the same amount of ink off your stamp. And if you stamp, you're going to get an image that has all sorts of different levels of ink on it. So when you're stamping right next to where you have your mask, make sure that when you go back in, you always re-ink before you do that. Otherwise, you are not going to be happy. And then I like to rotate the stamp so that the next time that I stamp close to what I've already done, that it looks just a little bit different. And I'll also change the height so that the image looks a little different than the one right beside it. I'm going to go ahead and rotate this and sort of do the same thing. Now, let me tell you the other thing that I'm going to suggest, and I've already done it, so I can tell you what I did and why I'm going to make this recommendation. I get inky doing this. I've already got ink on my fingers. You may not notice there's a little bit of ink that is right here on my card. One thing that I also suggest, and I'm kind of glad that this happened, is that you actually take, believe it or not, one more piece of Post-it note, and that you use this as your block. I want to make sure that I'm not going to get ink where I don't want it to go. So I'm just going to take this one piece of Post-it note and I'm going to move it around, but wherever I have my hand, I'm going to make sure that I don't mess it up. And I messed up this card. You can't really see it, but there's this little thing that made me crazy. So I made sure that I had that little piece that is going to protect what I'm trying to do. We'll see how well I actually do it. So I'm just going to continue to do my little stamping and try to get it somewhat abstract. We'll see. This is the fun of this because I'm not really trying to repeat a pattern on the top side or the bottom side. And then I'm going to come in and I'm going to start filling in where I have some blank areas. Again, when I do this, I'm going to make sure that every time that I stamp, even when I'm doing it not against where the mask is, see if I stamp that, it's going to be wonky because I've taken some off the corner. So I'm going to make sure that when I come back in, that I have re-inked and that I'm good to go. And I'm just going to fill in a little bit here and there. And again, try to make it look a little different in terms of the orientation of the stamp. And then, just to be sure that I'm not going to screw this up, I'm taking a blank Post-it note because I still have to do an area right up here. I know I'm going to be putting my hand down on the bottom. So I'm just going to put that Post-it note over what I've stamped, and at least there's a prayer that I won't get ink where I don't want it to be, because I probably would. And then I'll just come back in and put in a couple more images, re-ink, do it again, and then I'll do it one last time. And the beauty of this too is we all know you're never going to duplicate when you're doing hand stamping like this. So each card that you make is going to be a little different. And then I'm just gonna, I will clean this later, but I'm just gonna get some of the ink off of that stamp. And for right now, I'm going to go ahead and close up the evening evergreen. I will use this later to do the sentiment. but I'm going to close it up for now. All right. So I'm just going to reorient this, see if I can get a cleaner piece. And now I have the background for my card, and I have more ink on my hand. So it's really, really good that I have that little piece that protected my card. Don't get rid of this because we're going to keep using it. We're going to start getting it even a little bit more inky maybe. What I want to do is I want to start adding some ink and blending it. And I'm going to use 3 colors in the blending. I'm using the pale papaya. I'm going to use the soft succulent. And I'm also going to use the fresh freesia. And you've got a choice. You can start with the color that you would have on the edge. And up here is mostly pale papaya. And then in the middle of the card where I've got the band, most of that is the soft succulent. And then I'm going to show you how I did the areas where you see the fresh freesia. Now you can start at where you've got your mask, or you can start at the edge. I don't know why, but I'm in the habit that I usually start where the mask is. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to get a couple of these out of the way. I do have one brush that is dedicated to each color, but again, you don't need to do that. And I'm going to start with the soft succulent. And one more thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to orient this, and I'm going to grab that piece, that mask, from my inky hands, and I'm going to put that kind of down toward the bottom of the card. So where I'm going to start blending is going to be right at where that Post-it note on the top is, right by where the flowers are. When I ink blend, I will get some ink on the brush. I'm not pressing super hard, and I'm just going to work in a little bit of that ink before I bring it to the paper. And I'm also always going to rub a little bit off, and I'm going to start by doing some circles almost at the edge of the Post-it note, and then I'll come on to the cardstock. I'm not going to go directly onto the cardstock first, because it may be that I did not get enough of the ink off my brush, and I might get too much saturated color where I don't want it to go. And what you will find is that as you do this, the paper is going to absorb the ink, and you are not, at least I find, I don't need to get as much ink onto my brush. I'm doing this really, really lightly. It is not a very big pressure. I also find that if I put my finger on the top of the brush, that I feel like I have a little more control. I'm holding my brush handle, but I'm putting a little bit of pressure on that brush. And I'm now starting to put some more pressure as I'm doing this, because there is more ink that is going into the paper. So I am just applying more and more of that color. I can come back later if I want to add more. It's not like, you do it once and then you leave it alone. And what's really, really cool with the Post-it note or mask is when I get to a point and I just want to see how is it looking on the other side, I can peel this up just to take a peek. And I can see that that line is really starting to get defined. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to continue to put in some color. I'm not going to overwork this. I think we all have a tendency that we want to believe the more we work something, the more perfect it will be. And I think sometimes we need to just say, we're good. So I'm going to be good right now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip this around. I'm going to flip my little buffer around. And this is more because I have ink on my hands and I don't want to get that ink where it really doesn't need to go. And I'm going to go ahead and finish up using the green on the other side. It will be like a mirror where the area where we've got that mask is first going to have this really cool green, and it will be on the top and on the bottom. And again, because this side doesn't have that base of ink, it's just going to take a second for the cardstock to start taking the color. But once it does, you're going to find that the color really does go on a little bit quicker. And what you can also do is you can move the brush in different directions because the bristles are going to hold the ink until you get it on the paper. So I'm almost happy with this. And again, I'm doing this pretty lightly and just adding some color. And for right now, so I'm going to peek and just pull this up, see what it looks like. And there's a nice line that's been defined. So I'm kind of okay with that. So the next thing I'm going to do is I am going to bring in my second color. And this is where I do not have a great brain in terms of what is going to blend together well. I've taken some classes online about coloring and what works together and what doesn't work together well. And I really, really, really appreciate the talents of many, many people. There's some great classes that I've seen and I've done, and I do have this color wheel, as you can see, right by my work area. And I will admit that I do look at it to see, you know, what works and what doesn't. But I also find that it is easy to do some trial and error. And I would suggest that you take some time to experiment with some colors. And it's very easy to get just a piece of white cardstock and take out a couple of colors and see how they work together. You may find that they're an absolute disaster, and that's good to know, because a lot of colors that when you blend them together, they really turn into a muddy, muddy mess and are ones that you will never, ever want to use again. And you can do that. I can do that here where I can kind of see where I'm putting this pale papaya and the soft succulent together. Is that going to work? And I think you can see it turned a little brown, but I was okay with that because I'm going to be coming back in with a kind of a purpley. So this is where it's really your taste and what you want to do. The other caution that I have is I am going to be using a dark color, the soft succulent, and a light-ish color, the pale papaya. And what's going to happen is when I put that pale papaya onto this brush and I start blending, some of that evening evergreen that I used when I stamped has the possibility of getting onto this brush. It's really important to pay attention to that, and we will pay attention as we're going, because what you don't want to do, and you may be able to see that I did it a little bit, is in the middle of this ink pad, it's a little dark because I pulled up some of that evergreen and I didn't mean to. So I'm going to show you how you can avoid that. So I'm going to go ahead and just start pulling in some color. And what I like to do is I'm going to start on the edges. I'm going to actually start at the edge and I'll bring it in. I don't want to start blending first. I'm going to go from the outside in this time. And I'm just going to come to that corner and you can see that that color is also starting. I don't know if you can see, but there's not a lot of green on there. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to rub that off just to be a little overly cautious until I start getting this brush a little more saturated with that color. And I'm just going to bring it in from the edge and just get that edge going. and just rub it off a little bit more before I bring it back into the stamp pad. And this is because I'm using a very dark green, and there is a potential that I'm going to get a little bit of that green on my brush. Now, how can you avoid that? Well, you could use a StazOn black that will probably not bleed in. You can also be overly cautious and wait until the ink is super dry. You could bring in a heat gun if you wanted to, and just be, really, really careful. Now I'm going in the middle of the two colors, and I'm going to start blending them together a little bit. And I'm trying to be careful that I don't leave a line that looks like there is an intentional break between the colors. So I'm going to be going backwards and forwards in the direction that I'm using with my brush, and just try to get those colors kind of as blended together as I can. And then I'm going to pause, and I'm going to step away for just a minute. And then what I like to do is I like to just see when I open this up, do I have enough color? Is that okay? Or do I want to do more? And I'm okay with that. So I'm going to say I'm happy. And then I'm going to do the other side exactly the same way. And you can see I'm so happy that I have this down, because I've done some oopsies and it would have been a disaster. It was very sad anyway, to see some of those colors where I do not want them. And I'm just going to come right back in and do the exact same thing on the other side. And for me, this is relaxing. I think as you become familiar with how you do ink blending, and it takes you getting to know what kind of pressure to put onto the tool, and also what kinds of colors you like to use. You have to give yourself grace in doing this. And if you create something that you are really not happy with, maybe it's the colors didn't work together well, or maybe you got some areas where the color is more saturated than you wanted it to be kind to yourself, because you've learned something. It's not as if you have wasted time or energy. It's you've learned what you like and what you don't like. So, try it again if this is something that you would like to get into. And I really think the more you try it, the more you're going to like it. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to stop here, and I'm just going to see, okay, I'm okay with that. That looks okay to me. Now, the next thing I wanted to show you, and this is a little different. It's not difficult or mystical or magical or anything, but it's a little different than any kind of ink blending that we've done before. And it is the way that I put these lines in. And you can see that those purple are really lines. They're kind of soft, and they're really random. There's not the same pattern on the top and on the bottom. And I'm sure you can guess how I did that. This is where I'm going to use this Post-it note a little differently. And what I'm going to do is randomly put it at an angle. I'm going to do this side first. So I'm just going to make sure that that tack, where that tack is on that Post-it note, that's nice and tight against my card base. I'm going to bring in this third color. And I do have another brush. Again, if you're using one brush, and you can do this all with one brush, you don't need to wash these in between. Just make sure that when you're changing colors before you go into another stamp pad, just get the ink off the bristles. And it's just as simple as just swirling it around like that. And then your ink will be off, and you'll be able to use the new ink pad. So what I'm going to do on here is I'm literally just going to go right against that line, right against the edge of that Post-it note, and come back and get a little more color. And what I'm trying to do is put as much of that saturation of the ink right at the edge of that Post-it note. And I can check and see how I'm doing. I can just lift that up and I can see that there's a line that's starting. Part of it's because I don't have enough ink on my brush just yet. And I'm going to come back in, go both directions. And this time I'm really not going to overwork it. I'm just going to see if I can get a little bit of color. And I can check and say, yeah, that looks kind of good. And I'll just do a couple more on each side. And I don't even care if it's the same angle at all as the first one. I'm just going to come back in. I'm going to move this just a slight bit so that when I use my brush, that I get the ink where I want it to be. Make sure that that tap is down. Bring that in. Do a little bit more. I got a lot more in there. That's okay. That's all right. We're going to see what this one looks like. It might be a little darker. That's kind of fun. And then I'm going to come in and I'll do one more. And because I made that other one dark, I'm going to make this one a little bit darker too. So experimentation. This is kind of so fun. Come back in. Put another one over here. Cool. And then I'm going to do another quick 3 stripes on the top, and I'm going to make these completely random, hopefully a little different than what's on the bottom so it doesn't look like a pattern. And just bring that color in. And obviously this is something that, you can make whatever shapes you want. If you wanted to put a half circle, or you could get a butterfly. And if you had a butterfly, small butterfly, that's cut out of a piece of Post-it note, put some 2-way glue on the back of that. Stick that little butterfly down and just do some ink blending around it. And you're going to see that you'll have a little butterfly that will be the color that you started with. And around that butterfly will be almost a halo of the color that you put on for the ink blending. And just trying to get this color to come on. I'm going back to the same place on my ink pad, which is probably why it's not bringing up as much ink as I want. And I'll do it one last time over here.
So Lori, just another idea to avoid contaminating your ink pads. You can always do your acrylic blocks and put your ink pad to your acrylic blocks and then pick up the ink from your acrylic block.
Absolutely.
I think, was that Belinda that gave us that idea?
Yep.
It's been a while. It's been a while since we did that, but yeah.
That is a brilliant idea. And absolutely, you could do that. That would definitely make sure.
Yeah, that's what I tend to do. But...
Thank you. Then what I like to do when I am kind of done with my blending is I'm going to go back to the first area where I started, and that's between where my Post-it note is and where the flower stamps are. And this is optional for sure, but I like to just give it one kind of final defining blending. And in this case, I'm actually going to bring in the Evening Evergreen, which is that dark green. And I'm just going to go right by that Post-it note. And I'm just adding a little bit of dark to try to get that line even more defined than what it was. And I'm going to bring that in. Quickly go right at the edge. And I'll turn it around. And it's not really easy to see. I think it's probably something that the person who's doing the blending, rather than the person who gets the card, is going to notice. And it's just getting in a little bit more of that dark color to sort of finish the whole thing and get that definition between where the ink is and where the cardstock is, as defined as you can. And then I'm going to say, I'm okay. Let's see what this looks like. And I'm going to go ahead and take those masks off and just see what my ink blending did. And we can see that, you know, there are some really fun areas where there is no ink, and it looks like that's behind where the very vanilla piece is. And I really do like the lines that were created by that. It gives it a little bit more of a dimension. So I'm going to bring back in the example and just I'll show you how I finish this off. And this may or may not be something that you want to do. I just wanted to show you one more quick way to add a little bit more dimension to the card. This would be, in my opinion, perfectly beautiful if I stopped here and I stamped my sentiment. I think it's great. I'm going to do this one more piece, which is I'm going to add in those 2 lines of the fresh freesia. And I wanted to do that because I wanted to bring out that color since I've used it in the ink blending. And I'm going to tell you, I'm going to use a couple more Post-it notes. I'm actually going to use the ones that I've already used. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the ones I've already used and I'm going to put them right up against where I'm going to be ink blending. So I'm going to actually put them back, and hopefully that ink is dry enough that I'm not going to get inky. So I'm taking them and I am putting them upside down. And then that other Post-it note that I used as my sort of block, I'm going to eyeball this. I'm just not going to. You can get out a grid piece of paper if you want, or you can eyeball it, make you happy. I am going to bring that so I have a little strip that is on my card base that is open. And I'm going to come back in and I'm going to put in a little strip of the fresh freesia there. And I'm going to turn this upside down. I just want to give that a good push to make sure that those Post-it notes are pretty much adhere to my card base. And I'll use, come back in. And I'm just going to go right between those 2 pieces that I've got pulled down. And I'm giving it a stripe. And this is pretty quick because it's just one color. And we're done. And again, I can peek. And the fact that there's that little bit of white or vanilla in between, I'm good with that. So I've got my little stripe. And then I'm going to do the exact same thing on the other side. And I'm going to try and get it to be the same width. If it's not, it's fine. It's okay. Not a big deal. And the nice thing about using Post-it notes like this is you've got a straight line, easy to line them up against each other. Just gonna bring it over, grab my brush, do a little ink blending, which is really just putting one color down. And if you wanted to do multiple stripes, you can definitely do that as well. And then I'm going to say I'm happy. And pull this off. And now I have those two little bands that are also included. And then what I did to finish the card is I have already set up my Stamparatus with the stamp that I'm going to use. This comes from that new Elegantly Said stamp set. And I have it in my Stamparatus, so I need to put my card. I'm just going to bring that in. Get some of my brushes out of the way.
And this is
And then I will add in that sentiment. This is, I think, just a really pretty script. So grab the ink, and I'm using the dark ink on this. I just wanted to bring back the dark color from the flowers that I used. And ink that up, and I'll bring it in and put the sentiment in the middle. And what's nice about this is, you know, this can be a production line card too, but the fun part of it is if it's a production line, each of the cards will obviously look different because randomly stamped flowers that you start with, the randomness of the blending that you do, the intensity of the color will be completely different, but they will be the same basic design. So these are the two. And get them on a clean sheet of paper so at least they look a little bit better. So these are the two. Very, very different, but very similar. And I'm still getting ink all over myself. You know, a couple things to think about. And Maggie, I really appreciate you bringing up the how not to contaminate your ink pads. And by using your acrylic blocks and putting your acrylic block into your ink pad and getting ink on those blocks is a great way to make sure that you're just getting the ink and you're not bringing ink back to the ink pad. Absolutely. Also think about different shapes that you can use for masking. You can tear pieces of paper too. You could tear some Post-it note and do a really nice random edge. Grab a circle. You can use that as a mask. We've done that before. Just make sure that it's thin. This is cardstock. I wouldn't want to use that. Make sure that it is a thin copy paper or Post-it note. And then have fun if you want to put some additional kind of splashes of color by using your masks or using some other things to give just a little bit more to the design. It's a great way to add depth and interest, and this is on a flat sheet of paper. You can bring it up if you want with a couple of sequins or gems, and then you're good to go. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.